So this next piece of the puzzle, Jesus is going the next morning, and the elders and the leaders confer together. One of the things that's interesting about the tradition in the Gospels is that you have the most unlikely people getting together in order to conspire against Jesus. I mean, they hated each other. The chief priests, the elders. That's at least that's not a terrible arrangement. But in the Gospels, you've got the scribes and the Herodians and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and all of a sudden they all team up. That gives you the picture. So it says here they bound Jesus and they take him to Pilate. This looks to me to be a Caravaggio. His paintings of sacred themes always have that kind of bright light on the main subject. In any event, before Pilate, he goes, Judas, his demise is recorded. Very difficult to work through that. And then Pilate questions Jesus. You say so. He said, you say so. King of the Jews. So there's at least an antecedent knowledge that Jesus came broadcasting some sort of kingdom. And the chief priests and elders, of course, Jesus doesn't answer. And they make all kinds of accusations, and he doesn't give any kinds of answers. If you compare this to Mark, same kind of thing in brevity, And then, of course, Luke, the whole assembly rose as a body, right? This is Luke's Gentile audience, right? Luke has a preference for this Gentile audience, and so it's important for Luke to show the difference between Pilate. Pilate's like caught; he can't do anything else, and so I like how they say that we found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor. So this puts the Roman focus, that this is not about, Jesus wasn't coming for them, but that's their allegation. And again, you say so. Now, look at John. Here's where they take him to Pilate and they get the accusation. Pilate enters the headquarters and summons Jesus. And now here's a more interesting dialogue. Do you ask, Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me? And Pilate said, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and chief priests have handed you over. And then Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Interesting, isn't it, that Jesus talks about getting handed over to the Jews? He was a Jew. John's gospel is difficult on several of these points, and it shouldn't be avoided. But the one thing that John's gospel does is it frames Jesus' kingdom as not from this world. And then, and he says it in not from this world, and kingdom is not from here. Pilate says, so you are a king, you say, and this parallels the other records, you say so. You say that I am a king, for this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. Pilate asked, what is truth? I think that's fascinating. I think it's so interesting that when Jesus says these words, Pilate is listening and asks, what is the truth? You see, there is a very subtle way that if we look at it carefully, that Jesus draws Pilate in. That Pilate isn't even the captain of his own ship. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate says, what is truth? The inquiring Pilate, almost unwittingly, is brought into the purview of the grace of God in that split second. Now, that is not to say, that is not to distance Pilate from responsibility. What it is to say is that Jesus does the same with all who have sinned and fallen short, right? That's a Romans passage. But God so loved the world that he sent his son, that anyone, right, all who would call on his name, John 3:16 and 17. So I find that interesting within the scope of the trial scene. Now, Luke's version of the trial scene has a couple of additional items to it. And so Pilate can't find any problem, and so Jesus goes to Herod. Now you see, there's nothing beneath here. And so when you don't see any references beneath the passage, that tells you that there aren't any parallels in Matthew, Mark, or John. So Jesus is to Herod and to Herod's jurisdiction. This, of course, is not Herod the Great, but the next generation. Herod the Great is the one who dies shortly after the Magi, at least in some versions. Of course, we have the other opinion is that this is the same Herod, but Herod the Great dies before Jesus. This Herod, of course, is just like George Foreman has all of his kids named George Foreman. Herod named a bunch of his kids Herod too. So you get that kind of sequence. You get that kind of thing. Look at this. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad. That's the most unanticipated thing from the trial. He's happy to see him. He questioned Jesus at some length. The chief priests and the scribes stood by. And that same day, Herod and Pilate became friends. So you've got this interesting, hey, we like Jesus. We're both Jesus guys for Pilate and for Herod. Nonetheless, Jesus is sentenced to death because everyone has conspired against him. They can't find any charge against him. They all shouted. This is where the scene changes. Give us Barabbas. Crucify Jesus. And so, still trying, he had no other option, it seems, and so he handed Jesus over. Pilate was no friend of the Jews. In fact, I have a picture of a seat that was found at the amphitheater in Caesarea, and it's a big stone, and on the underside of the stone, it had Pilate's name. And what they did in the first century when Pilate died is they made the stone that marked Pilate's association with the amphitheater. They turned it over, made it a seat, and you know what you can do on a seat. That inglorious result for the stone that commemorated Pilate's interaction with the Jews. Josephus, that ancient Jewish scholar, also records how difficult a relationship Pilate had with the Jews of his day. And so we have the trial scene. It's a fait accompli. Jesus is handed over, and it's the crucifixion. Now, there are a couple of interesting pieces that you get with if you see here, Matthew, Mark, and John, and Luke, Simon of Cyrene, who is compelled to take the cross. And they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. Apparently, the flogging Jesus receives is so brutal that he can't even bear his own cross. We're going to talk about crucifixion in just a moment. So Jesus, this extended little teaching, weep for the days, weep for the days that are ahead. Two others are there, and so he prays. Notice the brackets. These brackets indicate that in the Greek, this probably it's not really reliable. They divide his clothing and they mock him. They put the inscription, "This is the King of the Jews." And one of the criminals there begins to ridicule him. And the other one says he doesn't deserve, he's done nothing wrong. That's just like anybody who's in prison. They say that we're all innocent in here. Nonetheless, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." So I wanted to show this because it's just, you don't really even realize what's happening. Here it is, right? They came to the place that is called the Skull, and they crucified Jesus there with the criminals. I mean, every gospel is the same in this regard. They crucified him. I mean, there's no build-up. There's no description of it. There's no there's no, you don't get any interaction. You don't get Jesus crying out in pain. You don't get any of the descriptive words. You have the description of the conversations. Crucifixion was brutal in the ancient world. Crucifixion was a feature that was so horrific that people rarely discussed it. Seneca, in his moral letters to Lucilius, will share just a little bit about crucifixion. But even there, you get very little information. There are a few. Martin Hengel has written a book called The Crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and in that book, it's probably the definitive book on crucifixion, and he just lays out the brutal description of what crucifixion was like. There are a few examples. One is really difficult to take. It is after the slave revolt. There's a slave revolt. I think this is the Spartacus slave revolt, but don't hold me to that because that might not be accurate. But the third member of the triumvirate, Marcus Crassus, that's the first triumvirate, Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Crassus. Crassus is given the job of quelling a slave revolt, and he's marching these hundreds of slaves back to Rome. And he begins to peel them off in groups of, 50 to 100, and he begins to line the Appian Way with crucified slaves. Crucifixion was meant for maximum pain and torture. The imposition of the nails, both at the feet and in the hands, was meant not to cause so much pain that the person would pass out. The person was supposed to stay conscious, inflicting maximum horror. The cross was erected. This one you can see here from the picture. This looks like a good 2 feet up. That's probably not too far wrong. There are people that think that the cross was even lower to the ground. There's no point in digging any further than you need to dig, and there's no point wasting wood that you don't need to waste. So above Jesus' head, the imposition, King of the Jews, the abbreviation, that would be part of that. Jesus' mother and his disciple are supposed to be right there. You can see the image of that right in front, right by the picture there. Crucifixion was, there are records of people surviving on crosses for a number of days. People, in fact, would bring water and food in some cases with the hope, foolish as it may have been, that the cross, the sentence would be removed and the person could be rescued. Crucifixion was reserved for the slaves, for foreigners. You could not be crucified as a Roman citizen. There was a really glaring example of that, and Cicero was the attorney to defend the person, his family, because they crucified a Roman citizen and put him on public display. And Cicero, I guess that's in 70 BC, defends and prosecutes actually the people who did that. This has to be an instrument of terrorism, unspeakable. Jesus references the 3,000 or so from Tyre and Sidon that experienced this punishment. It's not foreign. In fact, it was meant to subdue enemies. The cross is referred to more often than anything else in Paul, because this is not a judicial image or a punishment image as much as it becomes a sacrificial image, that Jesus sacrifices himself on behalf of the world. And the crucifixion of Christ, the imposition of his blood, the pouring out of that blood is such that God suffers with us and God wraps us up to redeem and to reconcile us. So those are a few glimpses at the cross. If you've learned something or if something strikes you, make a comment below. We'll have another video on Holy Week to follow. God bless.